All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight as part of the Brock Environmental Center Learning Series. We hopefully you'll agree have a great program for you tonight, charting the course for Chesapeake Bay striped bass. Uh, Obviously, one of the most iconic species in the Chesapeake Bay, and there's a lot going on when it comes to management that's getting started right now. And we have a wonderful lineup of speakers to hopefully explain this process a little bit better for everyone and give you a chance to answer questions. First, I'm going to just really quickly call out our three speakers tonight on the panel. They're going to give a little bit more detailed introduction in a minute. But first of all, from the American Sportfishing Association, we have Mike Wayne. From CCA Maryland, we have Dave Sikorsky. And from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Maryland office, we have Allison Colvin. So I don't think this fish needs any introduction, but just a little bit about striped bass. It's obviously the most iconic fin fish here in the state saltwater fish, both in Maryland and Virginia. So I think those are just great examples of how much striped bass are part of the history and the culture of the Chesapeake Bay, but really the entire Atlantic coast as well. Here, moving back to the Chesapeake Bay, about 70% of the striped bass population along the entire Atlantic coast is actually born here in the Chesapeake Bay. And in the coming weeks and months, the larger striped bass will actually start moving into our freshwater river systems to actually start that spawning activity. After striped bass spend usually 4 to 5 to 6 years in the Chesapeake Bay, they move out and start to join that coastal population that migrates up and down the Atlantic coast each year. Tonight, one of the things we're going to be focusing on is actions by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which has kind of kicked off this process. And so many of you all tonight may not be real familiar with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. So I wanted to provide a little bit of background about this organization. It was actually founded in the 1940s, and it was really founded because people were realizing that fish don't do a great job understanding political boundaries. And species like striped bass, as they migrate from one state to another throughout their life cycle or during a season, prior to ASMFC, each state really had the opportunity or the economic interest to catch as many of those fish as they could. And that really doesn't work out well when trying to manage a coastal species. So going back to the 1940s, the states realized we needed to do something to help with that. And so the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission was formed. And it was actually approved by Congress as an interstate compact back in 1942. It manages 27 different species that inhabit primarily our nearshore waters along the Atlantic coast. And it is comprised of all the states along the Atlantic coast from Maine to Florida, plus Pennsylvania, as you can see there in their logo. Also, NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well. Primarily, the way states are represented at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is each state has 3 reps that sit on the commission. One is the fisheries manager for the marine species in their state. There's also a state legislature who is represented there as well. And then there is a citizen rep as well. Going back or coming forward a little bit in the history of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, one of the things that really gave the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission the power to do its work actually happened because of striped bass. In 1984, Congress passed the Atlantic Striped Bass Conservation Act. And this act recognized the importance of striped bass, both from a commercial and a recreational perspective along the Atlantic coast. Another really important piece of that legislation was it actually gave the Secretary of Commerce power to shut down fishing for striped bass in any state that wasn't adhering to the management plan for striped bass. And nowadays that authority has been extended to all the fish species that the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission actually manages. In addition, that act also provided money for Maryland and Virginia to propagate, basically raise striped bass in hatcheries and release them in the wild. And that was part of the restoration efforts for striped bass that got started in the mid 1980s. So where we are now, as many of you all, especially those of you all who fish for striped bass, know that the population of striped bass is not what it was 10 to 15 years ago, mid 90s to mid 2000s, when, as you can see from this chart, striped bass were so abundant. And the way we tend to measure the abundance of striped bass is by the number of adult females in the population. So that's referred to commonly as the female spawning stock biomass. And we're going to come back to the graph on the left here several times throughout the evening, and folks are going to do a much better job explaining it than I'm going to right now. But basically what we can see here is the population is not as healthy as it once was, and we want to start returning that population level to more sustainable, healthy levels that we saw, like I say, up till about 2005 or so. The way this process gets kicked off at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is through a public information document. And that got released about a week and a half ago, and the public comment period for that runs until April 9th. And so think of this as kind of a scoping of the public comments about what people want to see when it comes to striped bass. A couple of reasons that we started this process is the last time we made a major change to the striped bass management plan was 2003. Since that time, obviously the stock status has changed. Basically, the number of fish in the population has changed significantly. In addition, what we understand about this population has changed tremendously as well during that time. So the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission and its striped bass management board decided this was the right first step in terms of moving out into get public comment on should we change our management program. If we do want to change it, how do we go about doing that? And so the public information document actually contains basically 10 different questions where we're currently asking for public comment. So hopefully that's a good background, and we're going to start getting a lot more here from that. So I want our three panelists tonight to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their organization as well. So I'm going to start with Mike Wayne from the American Sportfishing Association.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm excited to be on here. I appreciate you guys inviting me to join this conversation. I think it's great to have so much interest in such an important species, not only for the Chesapeake Bay, but also the entire Atlantic coast. My name is Mike Wayne. I work for the American Sportfishing Association, and we are the Recreational Fishing Industry Trade Association. A bulk of our membership is made up of tackle manufacturers. So think about anything that you use to go fishing is made by our membership recreationally. And our mission is healthy fisheries, clean water, and access to both. And so I work on the policy team at ASA, and we engage on a lot of different topics across the nation. And my specific region is the Mid-Atlantic and New England region. And so striped bass is a huge topic for us. It's a major driver of economics in the region, especially in the Bay as well. And I just wanted to share some stats with you. So across the Atlantic, recreational fishing is enjoyed by 6 million anglers annually. And I would say a bulk of those anglers participate in this striped bass fishery. Those anglers contribute $11.3 billion to the economy and support over 100,000 jobs. So recreational fishing is big business. And we really do enjoy participating in these fisheries, especially when it comes down to striped bass. So thanks for having me on, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts on how we move forward with this important fishery.
Thanks, Mike. Dave, if you'll now take a few minutes to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. My name is David Sikorsky, and I'm the Executive Director of Coastal Conservation Association Maryland, or CCA Maryland. CCA Maryland is an organization of recreational anglers that is a proud state chapter of the nation's largest coastal angler organization, the CCA. So CCA was founded in 1977 on the Texas Gulf Coast after rampant overfishing had depressed namely redfish and speckled trout populations, which are two key popular recreational game fish species in the Gulf. And so, the idea was that recreational anglers have an invested, or are invested in our resource, always want to stand up and take care of it. And so CCA was founded to do just that. And we're proud to have state chapters from here in Maryland, south down to Florida, around the Gulf to Texas, and our full West Coast. So we cover a large portion of this nation's coast. And here on the Atlantic coast, like Mike mentioned, striped bass is such an important fishery. So it's such an important part of the work we do, the work I do every day. I first came into finding out about CCA as a volunteer, as an avid angler. I spent a great deal of my life on the water, by the water, thinking about the water. And so I volunteered first for CCA and have been at the helm as executive director for about the last 4 years. In that time, I've also had been an advisory panel member at ASMFC. So the ASMFC has advisory panels for each species, and I've been on the striped bass and menhaden AP for quite some time. And in the last February meeting, I was honored to take the legislative seat that you mentioned earlier, Chris. So I'm now the legislative proxy that sits on almost all the species boards at ASMFC, all but menhaden, river herring, and shad for Delegate Dana Stein, who is Maryland's legislative appointee to the commission. So, it's great to be working through these issues every day, come at this as a passionate angler. That's who I represent. That's who our membership is. We're a grassroots organization that relies on avid anglers and caring folks to get involved in this process. So I'm really, really happy to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, for participating tonight. Allison, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, but before I do, I believe that our esteemed moderator tonight was remiss in introducing himself. So everyone, if you are a repeat customer to the Brock Learning Series, you probably know Chris Moore, CBF's Senior Regional Ecosystem Scientist based out of the Brock Center in Virginia Beach. But if you don't, he'll be our moderator tonight. So thank you, Chris. As he mentioned, I'm Allison Colden. I'm the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Maryland Fisheries Scientist. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation is the largest regional conservation organization dedicated to saving and preserving the Chesapeake Bay. Our primary focus is obviously on water quality and habitat, but we've been involved in fisheries work in the Chesapeake region for over 30 years. And as Chris mentioned, striped bass is one of the most iconic and important fisheries in both Maryland and Virginia. And so we have been hard at work for many years to try and preserve, restore, conserve this species for the enjoyment of recreational anglers and others, and for it's important to the ecosystem. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you, and thanks for covering my lack of introduction tonight. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out with some questions for our panelists, and at the same time, you as viewers can basically enter questions into the Q&A function, and at the end of the night we're going to answer as many of those as possible as well. So please continue to put those questions in, and we'll get to get as many of those tonight as we can. So I'm going to actually start the questions out tonight with Allison and have her give us a bit of a background, a little more in depth than I did, about how striped bass are doing and what is our latest understanding of the striped bass stock and the challenges it faces moving forward.
Well, thanks, Chris. As you know, how are striped bass doing is one of the most common questions that we get at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And the way that our organization tends to answer those types of questions is through our State of the Bay report. So if you're familiar with the State of the Bay report, it comes out every 2 years. Our most recent report, our 2020 report, was released in January of this year. And if you want to go to the next slide, Chris. A lot of people were a little bit shocked to see how our Rockfish score changed. So from 2018 to 2020, Chesapeake Bay Foundation's score for Rockfish declined 17 points from an A- to a C+. And that really reflects what we have learned over time with the most recent stock assessment. So Chris, if you would pull up that graph for us again. So as he mentioned, we'll spend a lot of time with this. So hopefully by the end of tonight, you all be super familiar with all of these concepts related to fisheries management and feeling ready to go to participate in the ASMFC process. But just to get you started here, as Chris mentioned, there's a couple different ways that we measure the quote health of the striped bass population. And one of them is how many female spawning fish are out there. So on this graph on the bottom, you have your years on the bottom, across the bottom, representing time from 1982 to 2018. And then what of the blue shaded area is representing the total weight or the total biomass of the female fish along the entire Atlantic coast. And what's important to notice is from about 2010 forward, we see that declining trend. And that is kind of something that people had been seeing anecdotally for a while. You know, recreational anglers recognize these types of trends. Commercial fishermen can recognize these types of trends. But we've seen this decline over time, which is concerning for us. The other thing which is concerning is another measure that we use to measure the health of the population, which is that tan line that you see, and that is our recruitment. Recruitment refers to the number of small fish that are being reproduced every year. So it's the number of fish that are born, and then the number of fish that are counted about a year later. So you can see in the most recent years, there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of variability all the time, but in some of the most recent years, we've seen a declining trend in that recruitment as well. And that has been particularly visible in the Chesapeake Bay region. Maryland does a survey every year. The striped bass young of year survey is what it's called. Young of year meaning the fish that were born in that year. And we have seen a couple of low years of recruitment over the past 10 years or so. And the reason that's important is because you only start out with so many fish. And over time, those fish are either going to grow and be caught or die or survive. So you start out with that many fish, and there's only going to be fewer fish moving forward because they're either going to be harvested or they're going to die naturally. So if you have fewer fish to start out with, it can be harder and harder to keep that many fish in the population moving forward. So where we are now, you can see that blue shaded area is below the dashed line. That's not where we'd like it to be. We'll talk a little bit more about reference points moving forward, but basically the most recent stock assessment threw up a lot of red flags for managers because we see this declining trend. We see there's fewer fish being born to replace those that are being harvested or die naturally. And so that's why what we'll talk about this evening moving forward are the types of management actions that have recently been taken and the types of management actions we should be planning for in the future to help address these types of declines if and when we see them coming into the future, but also how to rebuild from where we are now.
Great, Allison. Thank you so much. In fact, we'd already gotten some questions in the chat about going in a little bit deeper dive into that diagram. So thanks for doing that. So Dave, I'll turn the microphone to you first. Anything you want to add to what Allison said when it comes to current stock and its challenges? Oh, I think Dave's still muted. Mike, oh, there's Dave. He's coming back now.
I'm sorry. I thought you had called on Mike. So no, there's a lot to say about this stock, this fishery, but fisheries in general. Allison hit on it a bit. For fish to be born, fish die. It's a really complex task for managers to consider what's going on. I think you might have a slide kind of related to this concept. And to me, this, as an angler and somebody that's been heavily involved in fisheries management, this simplifies it as much as possible. So fish are born, and that's the recruitment side of things. Fish die, that's the mortality side of things. Fish are coming here with immigration, fish may leave with emigration. And so when you look at things coast-wide, that's what a stock assessment is doing. And I think it's important for folks to realize that what they see on the water, on their own boat or in their own creek, it's important, and it's an important part of the process. But what fisheries managers are really tasked with is the overall coast-wide picture. And a lot of the systems that have been built are built around that coast-wide approach. So there's no question, like you mentioned, Chris, early, talking about the founding of the ASMFC and its value and its importance. There's no question that the task that the managers have from a coastwide perspective is a big one. And it's important that everybody comes to the table to recognize the differences we all provide. So, you know, as a board member of ASMFC now representing the state of Maryland, I think about that frequently, that it's not just my own personal perspective, and there's a lot to learn from each other, but it really just comes back to this concept where fish have to be born for them to be available in the fishery. And that, again, that previous slide you can probably go back to now, really just shows in the low point in the early 2000s there, that tan line, and when it's low, well, we could have forecasted, and sort of did, that the bigger biomass was going to take this downturn as these fish recruit into the stock. So, you know, we have to take care of the estuary here, and it speaks to the importance of protecting the Chesapeake Bay for the long haul in the future, in all aspects of it, not just the fish, even though we are here talking about them tonight.
Thanks, Dave. Mike, you were actually at ASMFC for a number of years. And so I'm sure you've got a few thoughts on this particular question as well.
Yeah, just a few big picture things. You know, just remember, this is fisheries science. So it's really hard to count what you can't see. And so that's a really important component of what we deal with when it comes to fisheries policy management and science. And there's a lot of good, actually striped bass is a really good example of a species. We call it data rich, meaning it has a lot of data inputs going into the modeling that helps us understand the status of the resource, which is what this figure reflects right here. And so we're fortunate in that sense that striped bass has a lot of that information to help guide us in the decision making about what is deemed a healthy population, what isn't, what are the number of recruits, how many baby striped bass are going into the population, and really kind of balance the equation that Dave mentioned when he spoke and brought up that slide on kind of the population with births coming in and deaths going out. So I just wanted to add that, like, just trying to back us up just for a second. It's really hard to count what you can't see. This is a modeling process based off of data inputs. Striped bass happens to be a species that we have a lot of great information for. And remember, the other thing is, like, this represents the most current information that we have for the resource. And you can see on the x-axis here that the date stops at 2017, but this assessment was actually released at the very end of 2019. So there is some lag in when the assessment is completed and versus what current day is. And that lag is always a challenge between our understanding of where the resource is and what folks are seeing on the water today and tomorrow. So it can be a frustrating process because there is that lag there. But like I said, we do everything we can to use as much information as we can to make informed decisions on how to manage this resource. So I just wanted to spend a little time on that. Thanks, Chris.
No, thanks, Mike, for pointing that out. Yeah, I think we always are a little bit interesting to see how land-based ecologists or biologists who get to work with things like whitetail deer or waterfowl, they really have a leg up in a lot of cases when it comes to counting these organisms. And then the two, I think, Mike, you hit on a good point. Different people in different regions see different amounts of striped bass in any given year or different times a year. And so sometimes their perspective might be a little different than what's going on based on a coastwide assessment like this. So thanks for bringing those issues up. So Mike, I'm going to stick with you for the next question, if that's okay. One, I wanted to have you discuss a little bit about what has been done recently to help improve striped bass. Obviously, we're not starting this process right now. A number of things have gone on over the last few years to try to help get us in a better spot.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So as fisheries managers, the control that they have is a term that we call fishing mortality. And that simply is the rate at which fish die due to fishing. That could be from catch and release anglers, from a release mortality. That could be from people catching a fish recreationally and taking it home. That could be from the commercial fisheries where fish are caught commercially. So there are various sources of fishing mortality. And the way that management works is that we try to control, we being the managers, try to control the rate at which those fish die due to fishing. So with that context, what's recently occurred, and this figure shows it really well, is we've seen that the population has fallen, and this is the blue shaded area. It's fallen below what we call a management threshold. And that's the dashed horizontal black line that you can see across the screen there. And so basically what that tells us is that the resource, we consider it overfished, meaning the number of spawning females in the population is at too low a level. And so what can stakeholders and managers do to help improve upon that scenario? And that relates back to controlling how many fish we kill. And like I said, the we is everybody who participates in the fishery here. So in the most recent management action, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission took a reduction in harvest to reduce that fishing mortality rate and begin rebuilding the spawning population back towards that threshold, the dotted line, and then ultimately the target level, which is the solid black line. So the action specifically that occurred was an 18% reduction, and some of the states accomplished that reduction in harvest differently. So the way it's done on the recreational side is that the measures, the bag limits and the size limits and the seasons are adjusted to control that rate of mortality. That's how it works on the recreational side. And then on the commercial side, similar measures, but they have a slightly different construct in that instead of estimates of catch, they report their catch. And so using those reports, we're able to constrain their harvest to a specific level more, whereas on the recreational side, we do that with a combination of measures as opposed to trying to hit a specific quota level. So that action occurred and it was implemented in 2020. There were some other things that went along with that. So for example, catch and release mortality for recreational anglers has always been kind of a source of mortality that we've tried to grapple with as an industry. And so a requirement to use circle hooks when in coast wide. I know the state of Maryland was using those prior to this year, but to implement that across the entire fishery was a big difference when fishing with natural bait. The use of circle hooks is a gear type that reduces the amount of gut hooking of fish. So it helps increase the survivability of fish that are released back into the wild. So there was a couple different measures that went in through that, and some of the states did different things. But overall, the action was we need to reduce fishing mortality. We need to start rebuilding the amount of spawners in the population. And like I said, that is this blue shaded area. We need to turn that shaded area back towards those solid horizontal black line. And that's what that action was all about.
Thanks, Mike. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the reference points here a little bit later. Being that we've been talking a lot about spawning fish thus far this evening, one of the questions that came in was, are striped bass just like salmon, where they return to their kind of natal stream to spawn, or do they return to the same area, or is it a completely different area? So wanted to throw that out there, and whoever raises their hand first can answer that question for the audience. I think Dave won.
So yeah, they're not they're very different than salmon in many ways, but in the fact that they return to rivers to spawn, there is some similarity there. Studies have shown that fish do have fidelity or kind of commitment to that area they came from. I don't know on how granular of a level we've really looked into this question, but Chris, as you mentioned in the opening, up to 70% of the coastwide stock is estimated to start in the Chesapeake. There are other major producer areas like the Delaware River and the Hudson River. And there's a lot we know about where these fish go when they leave the area they were born. And so a lot of it relates to the time they spend in an estuary like the Chesapeake Bay, and then the time in which it takes for them to recruit out into the stock and move out there. And what's important in the stock assessment, which is a really, really complex document, but I recommend for people to read, is managers try and estimate this. They try and understand kind of what percent of the population of, let's say, 4-year-old fish are either mature so they can spawn, and if their females have made the choice to maybe leave an estuary like the Chesapeake Bay and only return during the spawning run. And so there's a lot of that built into the analysis and the model that exists to produce the graphs like the one on the screen. So it's complicated, but there is a lot we know about where these fish are born, when they come back, and where they go, for sure.
Great, thanks. Mike,
Chris,
are you raising your hand again?
Can I do it? Can I do
Sure.
it? I just wanted to add that, because maybe this will relate with some of the folks that are listening in. We do have tagging programs that occur on the spawning ground. And so basically what happens is there's a small, this is just a chapstick, for example, but there's a small tag that goes into the belly of the fish. It's not a chapstick, but it's a little tag, wire tag, and it doesn't hurt them. And the idea there is when an angler catches a fish and it's tagged, they call, there's information on the tag, and they call in that tag information and relay where they caught it, how big it was, what tackle they were using. And actually through those programs, we see that a lot of these fish that are tagged on spawning grounds actually get recaptured by anglers in the same locations that they originally spawned. So they've left for maybe a year, maybe a period of years, and they come back into the rivers. They're caught, the angler calls in that tag, and sure enough, that fish was tagged years ago in basically the same location. So we actually do have some pretty good information, and that's a really neat program because like the public play a role, the stakeholders play a role in getting some of the information back to the managers. So I just wanted to mention that, Chris.
No, thanks for doing that. I know here in Virginia, we have the Virginia Game Fish Tagging Program, and that is a very popular program. And one of the things that we learn about that not only is where the fish are at any given time, but how likely they are to be captured again, seasonality, where they move, and things like that. And it's so easy nowadays because a lot of the tags you can simply take a picture of with your phone and send that tag information in, and that way the tag stays in the fish, and hopefully it can be recaptured again, which will provide even more information to the fisheries managers about that particular species. All right, I want to move on to the next question, for this next question, Dave, I want to go to you first, if that's okay. One of the main takeaways from the most recent stock assessment was discard mortality. Some people call it release mortality as well, but these are fish that die after being caught and released. And this has been, as identified in the stock assessment, a large part of the overall mortality. So what's being done to address this issue, and what else can be done, and why is this such a tricky problem for striped bass?
Yeah, sure. So striped bass have, as such a popular game fish, like Mike mentioned, I think he said 6 million anglers participate in this fishery each year. These fish live in probably the most populated part of our country. So there's a lot of people that have access to them. Recreational anglers, under the most recent assessments, account for about 90% of the overall mortality or removals of striped bass out of the population. That's the newest assessment. Previous assessments would show that level at about 80%. So it's important to note, and it's included in the striped bass public information document for Amendment 7, that is largely what we're talking about tonight, to show that there's been different kind of views back in each subsequent assessment that's been done over time. So again, this most recent one, it was a shock to many to find out that the largest source of estimated mortality is those fish that we believe die after release. And managers assume that 9% of the fish which are caught by recreational anglers and released may die. And that's a coast-wide year-long figure. Scientists, anglers, managers all know that the likelihood of a fish's mortality after being released varies greatly based on the different conditions which may exist that fish is being caught under, or maybe the condition the fish is in. And I want to say there's a range of somewhere between less than 1% and upwards of more than 25% of an actual likelihood that fish is going to perish after being released. And it really all, again, depends on the factors that are at play. Situations like low salinity definitely increases the mortality rates for fish. Hot water as well, and that combination of the two is really definitely what Maryland sees in the upper portion of our bay. And so prior to the current management action, Mike had mentioned the reduction of 18% mortality coast-wide being enacted for the first time in the 2020 fishing season. Prior to that, Maryland had taken some initiative to implement circle hooks. So that's one important thing that Maryland did first, because that's another key piece of recreational discard mortality. Where the fish is hooked directly relates to its potential to survive when released. If I go way back, I would tell you that to start this topic, it's always important to state that all fishing, all recreational fishing, has a component of release that might exist. So no matter how good an angler is, they can't guarantee what fish is going to bite their lure. We do our best to target fish that are in a certain size, and every guy wants to catch, or every gal wants to catch the biggest fish out there. But you can do certain things with your gear. So the circle hook is a big part of that. Using artificial lures is also a great tactic to use to make sure you decrease recreational fishing mortality. But that stuff isn't regulated. The circle hooks are, your gear choice isn't. And so there's a lot of conversation around angler release mortality. As Mike previously mentioned, for 2021, all states have implemented a circle hook rule for bait. But wearing my striped bass board member hat, I actually got to participate in a work group that had a couple hour-long or 3-hour-long meetings to discuss what is the definition of bait. And so, it's really complicated to try and forecast, understand, and then regulate the actions of those 6 million anglers that might participate in this fishery up and down the coast. And so there's a definite distinction in what you can do through a regulatory package, and then just do through education and outreach, and then the potential kind of outcome of that for the fish. And so it's important to remember moving forward, there's things that managers can do that they know and they can count. This has had X amount of benefit to the stock, but there's certain things we can just do knowing that it's the right thing to do and more fish will be saved, but we might not be able to count it given the current systems that exist. So circle hooks actually fall into that category of, we know it's good, the board chose to regulate it and say all states should do it, but we really can't count the exact savings. And again, it's really the shallow hooking versus deep hooking. When a fish is deep hooked, it's more likely to die because it's going to get some sort of puncture down in its organs. The circle hook the goal is that the fish is hooked shallow in the mouth. CCA as an organization has known that this is an impact. We are an organization of recreational anglers. So there's one key thing that we've done, and that's to create a program called Release Sense. So that's releasesense.org. And it's all about educating anglers, making them aware of the conditions that might exist when they go fishing, helping guide them away from certain fish species in a certain time of year, like striped bass in the heat of summer. You shouldn't be out there messing with them, playing with them, catching them, releasing them. And that's a key point. And there's a lot to this and a lot of folks to manage. So I think that's a bit to understand. I hope that's what we were getting at.
No, I appreciate that. You touched on water quality a bit, and I want to move the microphone to Allison for a second, because she's been working a lot on the impact of water quality on striped bass and some of the programs that have been implemented in Maryland and that are being contemplated for the upcoming season as well, about how that does have a real profound effect on the striped bass population here in Chesapeake Bay especially. So Allison, if you could comment on that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. And for the Chesapeake Bay, I just want to explain a little bit more specifically why warm water is such an issue for striped bass, because it's not just the warm water, it's also the low oxygen conditions that we tend to experience in the Chesapeake Bay. A lot of people have probably heard of the Chesapeake Bay dead zone, which is a result of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution entering the bay, causing algae blooms, which then sink down to the bottom and basically use up all the oxygen as they're degraded. So striped bass, like me, my ideal optimal temperature is probably around 70 degrees. But striped bass also have a temperature that they prefer. Their physiology prefers. They, survive well at that temperature, and it's cooler than what we get in the bay in the summertime. And so they tend to like to hang out near the bottom. But in the Chesapeake Bay in the summertime, when we have these low oxygen dead zones on the bottom, they can't hang out there. They can't breathe, they can't live. So they're forced to move higher up in the water, which gets them closer to the warmer waters at the top. So the amount of habitat that they are able to inhabit in the summertime is much smaller, and they have stress from heat on the top, and they have stress from low oxygen on the bottom. And that's a phenomenon that's widely been known as habitat squeeze. And so basically these striped bass are forced into suboptimal environmental conditions. So they're sort of already in a stressed state when they are in the summertime and it's hot and there's no oxygen on the bottom. So they're already experiencing physiological stress, which can contribute to increases in their post-release mortality in the summertime. So in Maryland, in response to that 18% required reduction that Mike mentioned earlier, part of the plan was to implement a 2-week closure in the summertime for the 2020 season. That was in August. The 2021 season is still up in the air, I believe, but there's a possibility that could be moved to July. And those periods were picked based on the temperatures and the water quality that we see at that time. So trying to avoid catching striped bass to the extent possible, as Dave mentioned, you can't always choose what you're going to have on the end of your line, but trying to avoid as much as possible catching striped bass during the period of the summertime when the water quality already has them at their most stressed. So that was part of the logic behind those 2-week closures in Maryland. So we're hoping that some of that will help reduce the post-release mortality. And we'll have to see how that plays out moving forward. That's a relatively new management action. But the other thing I want to mention too is just as much as about the regulatory actions that have been taken, as Dave mentioned, it's a lot about personal responsibility. And there's a lot more that you can do as a recreational angler, as a private angler, than is what it's required by regulations. So another example of one thing that happened in Maryland this year, actually maybe last year as well, is they implemented these striped bass weather alerts. So there's a threshold of about 95 degrees air temperature where you start to see this really big increase in the post-release mortality. And that's from some studies that happened previously in Maryland. So if you look at the Maryland DNR Facebook page in particular is where I find them in the summertime, they'll have a red, yellow, green warning system. And if it's a red day or a yellow day, that's a day when they expect striped bass to be experiencing higher physiological stress because of those high air temperatures. So as an angler, it's not required that you don't fish on those yellow or red days, but you could choose not to go out fishing for striped bass on those days. Use those proper fish handling techniques that Dave mentioned if you're going to go out and catch and release striped bass, especially in the summertime, or just choose to stay home. Or you could choose to target another species. Maybe you want to go look for perch or something else. So there's a couple things that you can do, and educating yourself, making yourself aware of the types of conditions that can contribute to discard mortality, and working those into your calculus when you're trying to figure out what to do that day is another way that us as individuals can help contribute to the recovery of striped bass.
Thank you. And one of the questions that popped up in the chat was about what has Virginia done to help conserve striped bass, and wanted to answer that at least very quickly. Virginia was actually the first state on the Atlantic coast to start moving towards that 18% reduction. They actually got out ahead of it a bit and closed their trophy fishery for striped bass basically a year prior to the requirement that ASMC put forth to reduce catch by 18%. And they have actually kept that trophy season closed again for the 2021 fishing season as well. And so that's one of the things that Virginia has felt like making sure we keep the pressure off those large breeding females is one of the things the state can do in order to help this population rebound a bit. So great. I wanted to move on to the next question here. I'm going to start sharing my screen again because, Mike, this question is going to come to you. And what I want to focus on a little bit is this central tenet of managing any fishery is to use reference points. These are sometimes referred to as guardrails on the population. And the guardrails for striped bass were actually set a number of years ago. They're actually based on a specific year class of fish. So I'm going to put this slide back up, Mike, and have you talk a little bit about the guardrails that we use to manage the striped bass fishery.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. And this is a tricky one, so I'll try to talk slowly. So the biological reference points are, as Chris mentioned, the guardrails. You could think of them as a speed limit, goalpost, something that we're working towards that we know represents a healthy population. And specifically, there's two different metrics that we use. One is spawning stock biomass, which is that biomass of spawning females in the population that we've talked a lot about. And then the other one is fishing mortality, which we also talked about, which is that rate at which fish die due to fishing. And that's how and these two work together. Meaning, in order for this blue shaded area to reach the horizontal black line, we have got to control fishing mortality at a rate that will equate to the biomass being able to achieve that level. And so these specific horizontal lines that you see across this figure are, as Chris mentioned, are actually based on the history of the stock. So what we mean when we say that is you can see, and I'm going to go kind of through this figure again. So along the x-axis is the year, and along the axis all the way to the left is that the pounds biomass of spawning females, which is that shaded blue area that we were talking about. And striped bass in the early 80s were in a lot of trouble. And there was a lot of management that went into place, and specifically a moratorium, which meant that fishing mortality was limited to its very lowest level to the point where there was no harvest. You can see clearly responded positively on the spawning stock biomass. You can see from the mid 80s, I'm following the shaded X area right now, the shaded blue area. You can see a big increase in the spawning stock biomass because there wasn't any fishing mortality. There's very minimal fishing mortality occurring on the stock. And so what happened was we reached this peak in 1995, and the managers felt good about where we were with the resource. We saw some indicators with the resource that told us that the population had reached a healthier level. So one of those indicators is what we call an expanded age structure. So what that means is we can actually figure out how old a fish is by aging its ear bone, which we literally count rings on that ear bone, just like you would on the rings on a tree. And we can actually like take a fish, figure out how old it is, and then see how, like, what the population of fish and the various ages that are in that population look like. So when I say expanded age structure, I mean that there was good numbers of fish at each age. And that was a metric that was used back in 1995 to say, okay, we've got this expanded age structure. We're seeing opportunity in the fishery for people to catch striped bass, whether it be recreationally or commercially. And this seems like a good level. We see some good recruitment, which is again that the tan line on the figure. We see some good recruitment associated with that. So there are various measures that went into making the determination that 1995 was a healthy level, healthy for the population and healthy for the fishery. And so what the managers did was they said, okay, let's set a target level that's higher than that, something that we can work towards. And that's that solid horizontal black line that is 25% higher than the 1995 SSB level. And so those are the reference points that we currently use. You know, if you think about 1995, we're in 2021. And so it's been quite a long time since we've been using those reference points. And you can see from 1995 to about, you know, the mid 2000s, we built up to that target level. And so that's shown kind of in the figure, that blue shaded area, almost touching that target level biomass. And then we've seen a little bit of course, we've seen decline since then, and we've talked a lot about that recruitment factoring into that, fishing mortality being too high. And so now we're working back towards that solid black horizontal line. And in order to get there, we're going to have to continuously control that fishing mortality, the rate at which fish die due to fishing. And that's where that recent reduction came in. And we'll have to see how that reduction, how the population responds to that reduction moving forward. But those reference points are based on kind of our history here and our knowledge of what makes a healthy resource with a couple other metrics mixed in, as I talked about. And that's one of the themes in this most recent question on management. They're asking about the reference points in the document. And so, as Chris mentioned, that's why we wanted to kind of review why the reference points are what they are right now.
Thank you. Dave or Allison, anything you want to add to Mike's comments?
I'll just add, you know, one of the things that he touched on was that broad age structure. I think that's especially important for striped bass because the fisheries for this species are so diverse along the Atlantic coast and the Chesapeake Bay. It's a lot of small fish, except for when, you know, the big spawners come back. But for a lot of other states, you know, it's primarily or exclusively an offshore fishery, you know, targeting those adults in the coastal stock. And so, you know, it's important to have your older females, but it's also important to have a lot of little ones coming up behind. So a broad age structure provides that stability over time because as I mentioned before, you know, if you start to fish at really high levels, you start to lose out on those large, big fish, which contribute the most eggs to the population. And so the more you fish, the fewer of those big fish that you have. And you can see from this graph still, this is our favorite graph tonight. It's not necessarily true that when you see the highest blue shaded area, when you see the highest amount of female spawners, you have the highest recruitment. Take the 2006 to 2008, for example, time period on the graph there. But we do know that those fish don't just fall from the sky. They're coming from spawners somewhere. So we know spawners are important, but there's some other environmental factors that are at play there in determining the relationship of how many spawners you have to how many recruits you actually end up with. And the way that's described, and the way you will see it described in the public information document, if you take a look at it, is there is a weak stock recruit relationship, meaning that it's not a one-to-one relationship between the number of big females you have and the number of small fish that you get out of them. But I don't want to say that to de-emphasize the importance of those big spawners, because as I said, these fish have to come from somewhere. So we know that they're important, and the more that we can grow that population of big fish contributing, the more we can buffer against some of those environmental factors that cause declines in the recruits and the declines in the small fish. Because as we showed earlier, there's only so many levers we have to pull. The easiest ones to pull are the fishery management levers, right? It's very hard to control the births. It's very hard to control the immigration. The one box on that slide that we have a lot of control over is the deaths, and the deaths due to fishing. So that's where we go first, but we can help mitigate the risks to the population by managing in a way that helps to buffer some of that risk.
Great, thanks, Allison. That was actually a perfect lead in to our next question tonight, which I want Dave to take the first crack at. During the last round of management changes, both Maryland and Virginia used a management tool called conservation equivalency to meet their target reduction. Can you explain a little bit about what conservation equivalency is, and maybe should it be used in the future the way it has been in the past?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Chris. So conservation equivalency is defined. The exact definition is absolutely on the ASMFC website. And so I recommend folks to check that out. There's a really good Fisheries Management 101 section there where it gets all these things absolutely right. You can read them time and time again to understand them. But conservation equivalency is this concept that states have the opportunity to devise a plan that is equivalent to the overall management goals that the board sets coast-wide, but they do it in a different way, and that might be to shape something specific to their own fishery. This most recent management action, speaking of it from the Maryland perspective, Maryland had the option to have a one fish bag limit at 18 inches for all people that participate in the recreational fishery. And also that would equate to an 18% reduction in the recreational fishery, which includes folks that go out and fish on charter boats. And then the commercial fishery would take their quota, which in Maryland is roughly 1.44 million pounds, and reduce that by 18%. And so that was the kind of the off the shelf, right out of the plan, ready to go option that we could have taken. But Maryland decided instead to put together changes in the length of the season, the bag limit, and the length of the fish. And that all relates to kind of what managers think is out there in the population, and then what we call the selectivity, or what the model assumes we remove based on what's available to us. So the fish have to be out there for us to catch them, and that's all really part of the stock assessment. So ultimately what Maryland did was put together kind of a bunch of different pieces of the puzzle to come up with the plan that we're fishing under right now in Maryland. And for Maryland, again, it's a bit, this conservation equivalency plan raises a lot of kind of red flags to a lot of folks. And even for us from a CCA perspective, the current one we're fishing under was, kind of the wrong approach to the fishery at this point. And so when you say, is conservation equivalency a good tool? I think it absolutely is. But given the status of the stock right now, when it's overfished and overfishing is occurring, I think it's important to tighten down conservation equivalency a bit and realize that when we're dealing with something that's so complicated and so large, we really have to do everything in our power to err on the side of caution. And just one last point on Maryland's plan, because I will say I'm not 100% up to speed on Virginia, but Maryland's plan ultimately placed a one fish limit on private anglers. Charter captains and the people they take fishing can keep 2 fish. And then in the end, the commercial fishery, their quota was was barely reduced, if at all. And really the reductions in landings which occurred in Maryland in 2020 on the commercial side really came from the impacts of the coronavirus. So there's one big thing that the conservation equivalency can do, and I think it can undermine people's confidence in the management plan. We use periodic stock assessments to understand what our impact was. And unfortunately, COVID has delayed the most recent assessment update, which would give managers an understanding of what the Addendum 6 rules did for us. So, we would typically change rules, get an assessment, look back and see how it worked, and did we really control fishing mortality the way we wanted to? So unfortunately, right now, we don't have that coming up. So there's a lot to be said about conservation equivalency. We include a bit in our Angler's Guide to this Amendment 7 process, and you're definitely going to hear a lot about it because it is important. To me, it really is the cornerstone of state-by-state management. These states are working together, and so we got to find a way that we can find an acceptable plan for everybody. But at CCA, we say it often: the fish have to come first. So it's time to buckle down and make sure that our rules are consistent and do what's right for these fish.
Thanks, Dave. I know Allison wanted to follow up a little bit on this question as well, so I'll turn the microphone to her for a second.
Thanks, Chris. Well, to Dave's point, we use these models, and we've been talking a lot about trying to reach the target for the spawning stock biomass and trying to get back there. One of the main goals, which is defined by the current plan, and one of the goals that is under discussion in the public information document, is how long should it take once a management reduction is taken to rebuild that stock to its target, to that dark solid line on the graph. And one of the things about conservation equivalency that we've seen is there may be legitimate biological or logistical or other reasons why a state may want to pursue a conservation equivalency proposal. What we saw with this last round, though, is that there were a lot of states that took advantage of conservation equivalency, maybe even the majority of Atlantic states. And one of the things that was concerning about that was that, the technical committee decided an 18% reduction was necessary after taking into account all of the differences and all of the changes that were going to be implemented by the states through their conservation equivalency proposals. Although each state met the 18% reduction, the overall coastwide expected reduction was actually closer to 15% instead of 18%. So on a state-to-state basis, everything looks great, equivalent in terms of achieving an 18% reduction. But when all of those different proposals, which were different than what would have been implemented in every state if each state had implemented, the standard that ASMFC had developed, we're actually ending up not achieving the reduction that the technical committee said would be necessary to reach our target biomass within the 10-year rebuilding timeline. Now, we may still reach it if we're able to fish at that target. It may just take a little bit longer. But what that shows is that it's really not equivalent on the composite. On the whole, you can end up with actions that do not add up to the reductions that are necessary. And that can be a concerning component of conservation equivalency and underlines the need for making sure that those reductions are actually achieving the reductions that are necessary, not just on paper. It can't be a paper exercise.
Thanks, Allison. Mike, I want to go to you and wanted to get your thoughts on conservation equivalency a little bit too, but also one of the questions we've gotten from the audience tonight is about the use of slot limits to protect different age groups of fish. And as you're talking about conservation equivalency, if you could maybe shed a little bit of light on the use of slot limits to help protect certain age groups of fish, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the slot limit question. We've seen it used in other fisheries like the red drum fishery, for example. And the concept is, okay, if we don't have a lot of large adult females in the population, what can we do to protect what is currently out there? And the way a slot limit works is, fish below the slot are subject to less mortality. And then as they come into the slot, they're subject to more. And the hope is that enough of them make it through the slots to the point where they're at that higher maximum size limit within that slot limit. And again, they're subject to less mortality. So that's functionally how a slot limit works. There's a minimum size, there's a maximum size. You harvest within that slot, and then outside of the slot, those fish get more protection. And so, of course, that concept relies on fish making it through the slot successfully, making it through that harvest slot limit successfully. And so that's something that we'll have to keep our eye on, because the striped bass fishery has just gone to a slot limit pretty much coastwide. And so we'll have to see how that management measure is doing. And remember, we have that age structure to keep an eye on. And so as the population, as time moves forward, we can come back to that age structure and look, are we seeing a good number of fish making it through that slot? And all of this can be incorporated into the stock assessment model. I don't want to get really bogged down on the technicals here, but essentially we have the ability to kind of look at that in more detail. And so, yeah, I mean, conservation equivalency, it's a really hot button item. It is, as Dave mentioned, it's really important to the ASMFC structure. You know, the concept in theory is a great one, right? Like, it's hard to find a one size fits all management measure that will work well for every state across the management unit for striped bass. And so the conservation equivalency proposal is that fix to try to work with the local issues within the state to find specifics that still achieve the conservation goal, but allows for it to fix some of the specific state issues that those states experience. And the Bay region has used this program frequently and worked with the stakeholders to develop plans under the conservation equivalency concept. But as Dave mentioned, and Allison touched on as well, like, we're at a point where a lot of the indicators, and remember, striped bass has really good indicators as a species. We call it data rich. There's indicators that are telling us that the stock is in need of the population is in need of conservation. And so I think it makes sense to bring more certainty to the outcome of the management decisions that we're making. And when the stock is in need of conservation, perhaps we should be more risk adverse. And we know that conservation equivalency does create uncertainty in the management process. And that uncertainty has led to us exceeding our fishing mortality target previously. So if we look at this kind of over multiple years, which is the appropriate way to look at it, we see that when we use this conservation equivalency program and allow the states a lot of flexibility, it often results in mortality that exceeds what our expectations were. And remember, all of this is tied together. So we have to control our mortality, our fishing mortality, in order to achieve that horizontal SSB spawning stock biomass. So it's all tied together. I think it's an important consideration for both stakeholders and the management board to consider, you know, should we be taking a more risk-adverse approach when the stock is in need of conservation, with the opportunity to potentially revisit some of that flexibility down the road when we see that we've done a good job of rebuilding this population and it's at a healthier level. So that's just kind of some of the things that ASA thinks about when we look at how this fishery has operated We know that conservation equivalency is an important tenet to ASMFC structure, but hard decisions might need to be made. And I think it's important for stakeholders and managers to be considering those in this document, given the population level that we currently see.
Thanks, Mike. All right, I've got one more question for the panelists. I'm going to call this the lightning round for the three of you. And I'll start with Allison. What does your organization feel is the most important part of the PID? And I'm calling this a lightning round so we can get to some of our audience's questions before we hit the 8 o'clock hour. So Allison, floor is yours.
Duly noted. So I think there's two, in my mind, there's two different types of questions or two different types of issues in the PID. The first set of issues, which generally happens towards the beginning of the document, are what is our vision for striped bass, and what should that look like? So those issues are things that include the fisheries goals and objectives, the biological reference points, because as Mike explained earlier, those biological reference points relate directly back to the goals and objectives of the stakeholders of the fishery. And then management triggers. So what actions do we as stakeholders want managers to take once we see how the stock is in relation to those reference points, which relate back to the fisheries goals and objectives? So I think those three are really important because they really define the vision for all of the users and stakeholders of this fishery. And then the remaining are sort of how do we implement those goals and objectives and vision for the fishery. So we talked a lot about conservation equivalency in tonight's presentation. There's a couple other ones. We talked about discard mortality, which is a tricky one to try and address. But being a large proportion of the mortality for the species, it's obviously one that we can't ignore. And then for those who are following along with the PID, there's also issue 10, which is other issues. And it's your opportunity to bring forward any other concerns that you may have to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission that aren't already listed in the document. So I know one of our biggest concerns is water quality. I mentioned that habitat squeeze phenomenon earlier, and habitat. And one of the big things that we expect to change the quality and quantity of both of those things is climate change. So we've talked about warm temperatures, low salinity, low oxygen dead zones. All of those types of environmental factors are ones that we expect to be more challenging under the scenarios of climate change moving forward. So those are the types of issues that we think are most important in the PID.
Thanks, Allison. Dave, I'm going to turn the microphone to you next.
Thank you, Chris. So Allison mentioned a lot of really great topics. I mean, from a recreational angling perspective, I think the number one thing that folks need to really pay attention to is their own actions and what they can control. You know, if we as anglers that go out on the water to enjoy this resource wait for regulations to tell us what to do, then I think this fishery is going to continue to head in the wrong direction. We can all take proactive actions to choose gear that is less likely to hurt these fish, avoid them during times of year when we know that releasing them, whether on purpose or by regulation, it may impact their likelihood to survive. And but ultimately, it's up to managers as well, you know, to keep these reference points in place. The reference points are ultimately the goal and the moon. We are shooting for the moon so we can land amongst the stars. And you don't have to look very far to see the environmental impact we all have on this watershed, this massive and vital watershed. And so there's so much happening and coming downstream that'll affect the ability of these striped bass to spawn and the likelihood that the young recruits make it all the way to spawning age themselves. So there's so much out of our control. We have to really, really err on the side of caution on every piece of this document. And number one is keeping those reference points in place, because reference points directly relate to fishing mortality. And that's the only tool we have to control right now for a quick reaction. And we can just hope that we enter a period of more recruitment, because if not, we'll be back here talking about more reductions very soon.
Thanks, Dave. Mike, you're up.
What's left? No, Allison and Dave did a really good job highlighting basically everything. For us, I think it's worth echoing the importance of controlling fishing mortality. We've seen that become an issue for various reasons. And like I said, this is all linked, like Dave mentioned, like Allison said, and you echoed, Chris, like these reference points are linked. So if we aren't able to control fishing mortality, we will struggle to rebuild this stock. And we need good recruitment to help us along the way. And we don't really have a lot of control over great recruitment, as everyone mentioned. So what we can control is fishing mortality. That's what we really need to focus on. And hopefully we'll get some help from the stock with good recruitment along the way to help us kind of bolster that rebuilding. And then the one other thing that I wanted to mention, you know, as essentially the tackle industry here, we, in complements to the stuff that Dave mentioned with Release Sense, we've been working with our membership trying to help educate and inform on the release mortality aspect of this fishery. You know, we make a lot, our members make a lot of that tackle. So making sure that those circle hooks are available coast-wide with a new regulation. And then also trying to, as Dave mentioned, like change the culture here. You know, everyone needs to kind of think about what role they play in helping this stock rebuild and helping bring back a healthy fishery. And we can regulate that to death, but also, you know, you got to be very aware of how you interact with this important species and the benefits you get out of it, and do what you can to, if it's through releasing or if it's through harvesting, kind of managing your own behavior to help contribute to our rebuilding efforts coast-wide. So that's kind of a lengthy, kind of hot, you know, what's your one issue, but there's a lot in here. So I'm glad we've been able to talk about everything.
Thanks, Mike. No worries. We got over 60 questions tonight, and obviously we have worked a few of those in already. But so I'm going to try to group of the audience members has been, you know, abundance was going on kind of a downward trajectory for about 10 years or so before we started to act. And so I'll throw it out there to the panelists as to, you know, for the general public, why did it take so long to start maybe steering the ship in a better direction?
I'll tell you, to simplify it, we did not lower fishing mortality enough. There were several opportunities along the way where I recall as a young and avid volunteer at CCA thinking, why are we waiting to take action? Shouldn't we take much smaller and incremental action as we see trends start going down? But the reality is the previous plans didn't require that. And so, that's the choices the board made at that point. Now sitting at the board, I hope that a decade from now, we can say this is another success story for striped bass, because I know it's not an easy job, but it's, again, key to fishing mortality, taking action and taking more than the necessary action given the uncertainty that lies in this arena in fisheries management.
Thanks, Dave. Anyone else want to jump in? If not, I've got another one lined up. Allison?
Just a quick point. I will say, if you're new to ASMFC is a very slow-moving beast. And you can imagine it's because you have to get 15 states and 2 federal agencies to agree on something, and then all the states have to go back and implement it. So just like there's a time lag in when the managers receive the data that they can act on, there's also a lag that just comes from the process at ASMFC and then within the states to implement those changes.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump back in because Allison triggered a thought. There's nothing that stops a state from being more conservative than what the coast requires. So that's an important point. Virginia stepped out to take action quicker than other states, and any state can do that.
Great. We had a couple questions related to climate change. One of them focused on the fact that we're seeing more and more striped bass in Canadian waters. Allison, if it's okay, I'll call on you first. Just real quick, some of the implications of climate change that we're seeing on striped bass and we should be thinking about moving forward.
Sure. So one of the more general for fish species, not just striped bass, but for fish species in general, one of the things we expect to see is changes in distribution. And a lot of that has to do with warming water temperatures. So we expect as temperatures increase generally, as I mentioned, that each fish species has its own sort of optimal range of temperatures that it likes to stay at. And so those cold water species will tend to sort of march up the Atlantic coast towards Canada, and those warmer species from the South Atlantic will have a tendency to march up, and it's likely that the Chesapeake Bay region will start looking a little bit more tropical than temperate in the future. There have been some sightings of fish that you would have never seen in Maryland or Virginia 20, 30 years ago that are starting to show up off our coast and in the Chesapeake Bay. That's exciting for some people, new fisheries, new targets, but it also means that some of the species that we're used to seeing and used to interacting with may either be reduced in their distribution or may leave the Chesapeake Bay altogether. So changes in distribution is one of the biggest things. And then, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we're expecting to see is increased precipitation, increased storm events, and the intensity of those storm events. So the Chesapeake Bay and Maryland in particular, we are familiar with the deluge of sediment and fresh water coming in. And so those freshwater pulses can be really challenging to striped bass and a lot of other critters. But the change in those weather events is another one that we would be concerned with. One quick point again, too, on the changes in distribution, we also have to consider how the changes in striped bass prey are distributed along the coast. So those prey items, especially important in Chesapeake Bay, is Atlantic menhaden. And so if the distribution of menhaden changes and striped bass doesn't, or vice versa, and those two species are not overlapping as much as they should be or have in the past, that can cause some issues for striped bass if they don't have enough food. So those are things that we definitely want the managers and the scientists at ASMFC to keep an eye on.
Thank you.
Chris, if I could just jump in quickly and just add.
I've got a question I'm going to ask you too in a second, so go right ahead.
Okay, well, I mean, I was just trying to relate this back to the life history that we know for striped bass, right? A species that lives in saltwater and migrates into freshwater to spawn. And as we talked about earlier in our conversation, these fish do come back to the same rivers that they were born in. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about this question in the context of the life history for striped bass, and how will climate change kind of impact that spawning behavior of those fish coming back to the same rivers to spawn? And will that shift with climate change? And I think we do have some indicators like the tagging program, the juvenile, the baby striped bass surveys to help get some data on that. But I just felt like that's kind of what popped into my head, and it's a good question. How does climate change impact a species, and specifically a species like striped bass that has a really unique life history?
Thank you. All right, keep your microphone open there. We got a couple questions about the impacts of the pandemic on this. And obviously the reason we're here in a virtual world and not face-to-face is because of the pandemic. And there was especially some questions about what type of data may be missing because of the pandemic. So Mike, I know you're familiar with a lot of those programs like MRIP. Could you just give us a real quick, what your thoughts are on what may have affected this from a pandemic standpoint?
Yeah, so I'm gonna try and describe MRIP in a really short amount of time. But essentially on the recreational fishing side, the way we estimate catch is through a survey, and that survey is called MRIP. And essentially what happens is it's not a census, it's not a complete accounting of every fish that's caught. It's a survey in which anglers return to the dock. There's a dock agent there that measures the catch and asks some questions. And then that's combined with a survey that talks about the effort, like how many times have you been fishing in the last 2 months, or questions like that. That information is combined and we produce an estimate of catch for the recreational sector. As we've talked about, there's uncertainty associated in all of this, and that there is uncertainty associated in that catch information as well. But I will kind of relate it back to your question about how the pandemic has impacted that. a lot of the states weren't able to conduct that survey during COVID, during the 2020 year fishing year period. So we have what we call a data gap, missing information from that year. And they're currently working on, is there a way that we can kind of fill in that question mark using previous years, using kind of combination, using whatever information was gathered, using information from folks that were fishing. So that's basically what's currently going on right now in terms of 2020. You know, Dave mentioned that it has implications on sort of the timeline for the stock assessment. And when we get another updated picture on the status of the resource relative to the impacts that we've seen from that recreational data set. And you know, what we really saw, which was encouraging from an industry standpoint, was people were opting outdoors during COVID. And that represented an increase in participation in fishing as a sport, which was great, seeing people getting out there kind of trying to escape, you know, the inside webinars and TV and all that, and getting out there and going fishing was encouraging. And it's a matter of like, how do we kind of recalibrate, knowing that there were impacts from COVID on the information that we use that goes into our understanding of everything. So I know that wasn't very quick, Chris, but that's the best I could do.
Thank you. All right, no problem. I'm going to share my screen again because, you know, one of the big reasons we're here tonight is because we want you all to be involved in this process. And so hopefully everyone can see now, these are the public hearings, which started this week. Just like this program tonight, they're all going to be virtual, but this is really the opportunity for you all. You can obviously send a letter, but to attend a public meeting much like this, like we're having tonight, to give your thoughts on striped bass and also learn even more about the PID. So anyone, 15 seconds maybe about the public meetings? I know.
You should attend one.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of information, like background information. We touched on a lot of that in this webinar, but there's even more of that at these public hearings and kind of walking through each issue. And then there's the opportunity for you to share your ideas during the hearing. And you can see they're doing a lot of them. So if you can make yourself available to attend one of these, highly recommend it.
Great, thank you. In addition, here's the information for submitting comments. And I know a couple people, Allison and I think Christy, have put information in the chat about how to get to the public information document. But comments are due by 5 p.m. on April 9th. Make sure you do get them in by that date because there's a hard cutoff. If you still want to send by snail mail, you can do that, and the information's there to send to the Fishery Management Plan Coordinator for striped bass. And obviously, emails tend to be the most efficient way to get your comments in. Just make sure you do it by the 9th. Any of the panelists want to comment on that commenting process real quick?
Yeah, it's important. It's just like voting. It's really important. You know, everybody should be engaged in this process. I would say that fisheries management is probably one of the most transparent and welcoming of the public as compared to any other process out there. And it's all up to us to rise to the occasion and participate. And I just shared in the chat, a link to a YouTube recording of the actual presentation that staff will give at each public meeting. So if for some reason you can't make that public meeting, staff has wisely put together this YouTube so you can understand some of the content, and just keep watching it, keep reading through these documents. I know, Chris, you'll probably show some of the other information that's available from CBF, and I know CCA has done that work as well as.
That's the next slide up. All three organizations tonight have more information that you can go to and learn about this. These are the links that are available. I know the one from CBF is a little odd, but Christy's going to put that one in the chat as well, so you can get that. And of course, it will be in the recording as well. But that will take you to our action alert about the PID as well. But these sources of information will be up through the entire process, and so you can take advantage of those throughout the process. All right, next, if you need some more information, again, we obviously can't clap for everyone tonight, but I want to give a huge thank you to Mike, Dave, and Allison for being on here tonight, sharing their insights, doing an absolutely wonderful job representing their organizations and being part of this. I know all of them, and they live, breathe this, and believe it or not, do enjoy talking about it, no matter what. I think we could have probably talked for half a day if we wanted to. And so feel free to reach out to them as well as part of this. So thank you all, Mike, Dave, and Allison, for being part of this. Also, in the background, Christy Everett and Natasha Ratlev were huge in making this happen. One other thing I want to mention again, the Brock Learning Series was made possible by support of Jen Jenkins and Mike Newell. And also this particular one was helped made in part by the Founding Fish Alliance and the Patroon Group virtual series. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. Again, this was a great amount of information that was shared through this. There is an evaluation that's in the chat. Please take a few moments to do that. That'll really help us with these, and we hope to see you in person at some point soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Allison.
Thanks, guys.